Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In today's video, I'll be talking about who the main villain for a potential Spider-Man 2 DLC could be. It hasn't been announced yet, but I feel like that there's a pretty good chance that there could possibly be one. Miles Morales didn't get one, but then again, that was a much shorter game, so, you know. Anyway, I have 3 candidates for the potential main villain spot for a potential Spider-Man 2 DLC. Those 3 candidates would be Chameleon, Swarm, and Carnage. And if you're asking who's Swarm, they weren't in the main game, blah blah blah. Swarm is a Spider-Man villain, obviously, that's made of a bunch of bees. And if you did the Emily May Foundation quests, or if you were playing the main story and you just forgot about this character, there's a character named Dr. Young who's focusing on making, bee drones to help, bees in the environment. And my guess is that Swarm could possibly be Dr. Young, or someone using the robot bees. And if you're thinking that's a big stretch, it is, but I've seen a few other people talk about this, and I believe that in every single Spider-Man game, they introduce a new villain that we haven't seen before. Sometimes obscure, sometimes we know already, like Mr. Negative in number 1. And in number 2, was there a more... Oh yeah, Scream or Screech or whatever MJ turned into. Now, if you ask me, I believe that Swarm has a good chance of appearing in a sequel or, the DLC potentially, but I don't really see them becoming a main villain for a DLC. Maybe, like, the beginning villain where it kind of sets things up, like Sandman and Spider-Man 2. But I don't really see them as a main villain for anything, really. That kind of brings me to my 2 other candidates, Chameleon and Carnage. Now, Chameleon and Carnage both have a really good chance to be in the DLC, mainly because, 1, they were both teased in the side quests. 2, they both have heavy relations to the Spider-Man 2 game, with Chameleon being Kraven's brother, and Carnage, being a symbiote. Now, if you ask me, I believe that both these characters would work amazing in their own DLC. But obviously, they can't both be in the DLC, or one of them will, not live up to their full expectations due to the other being focused on more. Now let me talk about my evidence for Chameleon. Now, Chameleon is Kraven's brother, and since Kraven was a main character in the first part of the game, there could be a massive chance that, they decide to focus on Chameleon for a DLC. I could see this DLC working out as something's happening around the city, like things are going crazy and multiple people are falsely accused for crimes they didn't commit. And that means Spider-Man has to investigate into it. A bunch of people pleading innocent with no crime records ever, suddenly, robbing and murdering. And that'll leave them to the Chameleon. Now, that's, a very bad story for the Chameleon. I wouldn't like it, but that's probably the best thing I could come up with for a Spider-Man DLC. Now, if I were to focus more on the comics, I would have it be Chameleon pretends to be Spider-Man and, makes a bunch of problems for Spider-Man. Kind of like, how do I say this? Like Gotham Knights and how you fight the police. I could see that happening in the Spider-Man games. But the reason I don't think it'll be like that in a Chameleon quest is through dialogue, we know that he's done this before in the Insomniac Spider-Man universe. When we do I don't remember the name, but when we do the quest about the guy who wants to save people just as Spider-Man dresses up as him, Peter brings up that Chameleon had done that before. So I doubt that they would use it twice. Now, Carnage has also a lot of evidence. 1, they can't just be reduced to a side quest character or one-time boss battle in a 3rd game. He would have to be focused on as either the first main villain of the game, since most of the Insomniac Spider-Man seem to have 2 main villains throughout the game. number one, kind of setting the story, and then, number two, kind of driving the emotional bit of the game, like Doc Ock and Harry's Venom, which I theorize in the future could be some random villain like Swarm or something, and then Green Goblin is the final villain for the third game. Since obviously Norm is preparing the G Serum and he's talking to Doc Ock with some secret plans, which I don't know about you is kind of suspicious. Now, this is where it gets a little more complicated. I feel like Chameleon could be reduced to a side character or a, little side quest for Spider-Man 3, and people would kind of just shrug it off and be like, okay, that was kind of cool, and move on. Kind of like Tombstone in Spider-Man 1. But Carnage would be a much different situation due to how he was teased and how he is, in the comics and the movies. Well, movie. Now, if you ask me, I would prefer... Now, I'm very biased with Chameleon since he's my favorite Spider-Man villain. But I don't feel like he would work as well in a DLC as Carnage would. Mainly because if he was in the DLC, then Carnage would either be the first main villain for the, third game. Which I feel like it'd be kind of weird finding another symbiote, especially after the ending of Spider-Man 2. Well, not weird fighting Carnage, but I mean, like, it would be kind of repetitive of fighting Venom in the beginning of, at the end of Spider-Man 2. I believe that they should go with someone new or some new revamped character that we knew. Now, personally, I believe that a few characters would be added in Spider-Man 3, like Hydro Man, and they would bring back, Curtis Connors or whatever the Lizard's name, and Marco, Sandman. I don't think that Lizard and Sandman would be their villain forms. Same with Mysterio, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. I feel like having Carnage as a first-time set-up-the-story villain wouldn't really work. Since, obviously, Green Goblin's probably going to be the big main baddie of that game. Kind of like, Venom and Doc Ock before. Also, this is the final game, and I feel like having Carnage as a main villain for the final game would be kind of, I feel like it worked. The reason it worked so well in Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2 is that they chose different villains that were entirely new to the story that Spider-Man didn't know before, he didn't fight before, which you could say the same thing for Carnage. But I feel like Kraven and Mr. Negative worked way better for that, part of the game. Now, obviously, Spider-Man 3 is going to need to introduce and bring some, heavily rumored characters into the game. Mainly because, they killed off a lot of their villains, and maybe Rhino, but that's kind of up in the air at this point. Like, if you think about it, Shocker's dead, Scorpion's dead, Electro's dead, what else? Vulture's dead. Every member of the Sinister Six, except for Mr. Negative and Doc Ock, are dead. And if you think about Mr. Negative, I don't think he has his powers anymore, and he's completely reformed, so he's not going to pose any threat to Spider-Man. Doc Ock's obviously going to pose a threat. Well, obviously. But they're going to need to introduce a lot of new villains. And especially since in Miles Morales, the few villains were Simon Krieger from Roxxon, which I don't see them using at all in a future game. The Tinkerer, who's dead, and Prowler, who's also completely reformed. And maybe Rhino, but is kind of in an iffy place right now if he's dead, mainly because the Tinkerer stabbed him, but then again he showed back up, and Spider-Man 3 is a out-of-bounds head on a wall. So he's kind of in a weird place right now, but they need to introduce new villains. And I feel like that Carnage wouldn't really work as a first-bit villain for a game that's probably going to introduce a ton of new villains. I mean, the only villains I could really see them bringing back at all is Screwball and Taskmaster, which are both pretty controversial characters in the series. And I feel like that they would need Chameleon and Swarm as two characters to help boost the side quest and boost the main story. And Carnage is a more past DLC character, not as a first main villain. So I'd probably have to go with the community on this if there is going to be a DLC. Is that Carnage will be in it, and Wraith will also be a heavy player in that quest. Now, thank you all for watching, and have a nice day.